the youngest state senator in the state of New York. Some of you may know his father, David Paterson, Lieutenant Governor, state of New York. We worked together in 1984 for Jesse Jackson's campaign. Outstanding young man, an attorney by trade in Manhattan, has been a leader in the fight of young people in the battle against AIDS, drug abuse, staying in school and learning and being somebody. We're so extremely proud this morning to present to you the leader of the young movement in Albany, New York, Senator, come on, yeah. Senator David Paterson. Senator David Paterson.
Thank you very much. This is a beautiful building, the Harborside Financial Center, and it's quite an honor to be here with Mayor Rakowski and Councilwoman Willie Flood, and all of you who took time out to come and be together this morning to talk about trying to improve your community. I represent Harlem and an area you may have seen on television known as Washington Heights, just in the past few weeks. And in New York City, around the Wall Street area, we have a big financial center just like this. And the federal government was starting to build another building. It's 34 stories in height, and it cost $276 million to build this building. And when they were digging down in the excavation to build this building, they came across the remains of African Americans that had been buried there for 200 years. Now, they thought they had destroyed this cemetery years ago. The cemetery existed because black people were not allowed to be buried in New York City in the 1700s. So this area, where in what is now Lower Broadway and Lower Manhattan, around the Wall Street area, was not part of New York City at that time. Even those African Americans that were free were not allowed to be buried in New York City. And so when they dug down, they came across these grave sites. And they didn't regard it as a precious discovery. They regarded it as an inconvenience to their construction. But fortunately, we came together and started to fight to preserve this cemetery. And they said to us, well, we can't have a cemetery under an office building. But they would dig up a cemetery to put an office building on top of that. And so we have been fighting for the last few years, and for the last year, and if you watch Like It Is or you watch the McCreary Report, we have been trying to get them to understand that our history is as important as anybody else's history. Now the question is, why should we preserve this cemetery? What is so important about the artifacts or the remains of ancestors that lived over 200 years ago? What's so important about that is that if you want to command respect, then you have to give respect. Now, thank you. That gave me time to think of something else to say. Now, recently there were two movies that you probably saw. One was Boys in the Hood, and the other was Grand Canyon with Danny Glover. And in both of those movies, there were people who thought that unless they carried a gun, they could not receive any respect. But the reality is that they didn't give anybody any respect, and therefore it was only with a gun or a weapon that they could receive respect. And so the reason that we want to understand our ancestors, those who went through slavery, those who went through dehumanized conditions, those who didn't even know their other family members, is so it gives us an opportunity to ask for respect ourselves. Now, when we think about young people as they were portrayed in some of these movies, that's not the real story. Because the March of Dimes gave a parade earlier this year, and 80% of the young people who marched were African and Latino young people, but nobody covered it on radio and television. Just 2 years ago, we had a rap concert that featured A Tribe Called Quest, Public Enemy, Dougie Fresh, KRS-One, and the late MC Trouble. There were 35,000 young people at this rap concert to stop the violence. It was a Stop the Violence concert. There was not one act of violence. There was not one physical accident. All of the media covered this concert, but nobody reported it because nobody got killed, there was no riot, or somebody didn't get up and make some remark that could be portrayed as racist or something like the album Cop Killer or something like that. And so what we come to understand is that young people, many of you, are doing a lot of positive things, but nobody wants to give you your recognition. And so what's happening is this is a situation where you are giving respect, but you are not commanding respect. So what I'm here to tell you this morning is you are not going through anything that's any different than your ancestors or than your elders. Because when the African American burial grounds was closed in 1790, it existed from 1710 to 1790. When it was closed down, they were writing the Constitution of the United States. Now let me tell you a little bit about the Constitution of the United States. It included what was known as Article 1, Clause 2, Section 3, which provided for slavery in this country. It also included Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, which was the requirement that runaway slaves be captured. Now here we are 200 years after that Constitution, 100 years after we abolished slavery, and nobody has ever taken it out of the Constitution. Now what kind of respect can you give Americans who pay taxes, who vote, who go to school, who do all the things that you're doing, if you can't even take out of the Constitution an issue that involved their bondage and the bondage of their ancestors 200 years ago? And so we find ourselves today still fighting for the equality that we should have been guaranteed in the Constitution. And we find that we have the same problems with many of our ancestors and many of those people who look up like us in other countries, whether they be in South America, whether they be in the Caribbean, or whether they be in Africa. That we all, peoples around the world, are experiencing the same problems. Poor housing, drug addiction, unemployment and underemployment, crime, poor or inadequate health care facilities, a failed education system, and probably the heinous of all of these inequities, a racism that continues to exist 130 years after it was supposed to have been abolished in our country. And so as we stand to fight against apartheid in South Africa, to fight against dehumanized conditions around the world, we recognize that we don't always get respect, but we have an understanding with those people who have the same problems with us. And they may not live here in this country, they may live overseas, but the blood that unites us is thicker than the water that divides us. Thousands of years ago, somebody figured out how to make fire. They invented fire. Prior to that, we lived in the prehistoric era. And whoever it was, in my opinion, was probably burned at the stake that they taught their brothers and sisters to light. If you read history, throughout the centuries, the great inventors, the great creators, the great artists, the scientists, stood alone against the societies of their time. Every new thought was opposed, every invention was denounced. But these men and women of unborrowed vision went ahead. They fought, they suffered, and they paid, but they won. And what did they win? Freedom. People like Harriet Tubman, This is the 500th anniversary of the discovery of America. They have a street right around here, Christopher Columbus Avenue. But what American could be celebrated any more than Harriet Tubman, who went back into the South over 40 times to save her brothers and sisters from slavery? Who deserves accolades any more than her? Or Paul Robeson. Have you ever read about Paul Robeson? A singer, an artist, a scholar, an activist, a political scientist, a philosopher. He could have gotten along very well just by going along, but chose rather to speak out against injustice with the truth. Or somebody called Malcolm X, who lived in our time and offered us a steadfast, disciplined criticism and honesty that made a lot of people look at what America was really about. These people fought against injustice. They fought against those things that were wrong for the societies of their time, and they won. And so the reason that we celebrate them, as we go back to our original thought, is that we want to show respect so that when we go out and do things, we will also be respected. And so we have a number of problems that exist in our communities, problems that you know all too well. Drug addiction, the deadly AIDS virus, the violence that's plaguing our communities. And I'm supposed to stand up here and to tell you not to use drugs. I'm supposed to tell you to be careful in terms of your sexual habits because of the AIDS virus. And I'm supposed to tell you that violence does not cure anything. But no matter how much I lecture to you, and no matter what I tell you, only you can decide what you're going to do with your life. It is your life, and nobody else can really control it. We can give you all the facts, but in the end, you make the decisions. And whatever decisions you want to make, you should learn what it is that you're getting into. There are some dead-end streets that you do not turn back from. And you don't have to go down one of those streets before you learn that. But it is your ability to make a decision, your ability to make a choice, that is the real goal of education. Because education is more than just reading books and acquiring knowledge. Education comes from the Greek word edukere, which means to lead out. So it is only through learning and thought that we will ever be able to resist the temptation to use drugs and alcohol, to think about how we conduct ourselves in terms of being careful, because drug addiction and sexual activity is what is killing many people in terms of the AIDS virus, and to make sure that our highest rate of mortality in our communities does not come from the violence that we perpetrate against each other. Why? Because it is not a civilization when people are dying at the rate that they are in our communities. And so, when we who stand up here try to suggest to you what you might want to consider as you live your lives, what I ask of you is only that you do the same thing that a few people got up here this morning and tried to do for you. Find those people who are a little younger than yourself. Find those people who did not have the opportunities to have some of the experiences that you have already had in your young lives. Talk to them. Give them some of the information that they need to know. And as you go on in your careers, and you can do whatever you want, whether you become an athlete or a doctor or a lawyer, whether you become a truck driver, whether you become somebody who wants to be a teacher, whatever you do, try not to forget your neighborhood. Try not to forget where you came from. Try not to forget the people who are sitting next to you. Don't go anywhere and think that you're better than anybody else because you became a doctor or a lawyer or something like that. And don't let anybody think that they are better than you because they have a title or they make more money or something like that. Just remember that your community is as strong and your community has all the qualities that any other community has. It doesn't always get its proper respect on television or in the movies. You may not always get your respect on the screen, but you make sure that you receive it on the scene. And so, as I leave you, and thank you very much for being patient enough to listen to me, I would just like to tell you a little story about my high school graduation. Yes, I graduated from high school. At my high school graduation, there were two people that I'll never forget. One was Cheryl Clark, and the other was Emery Cooper. Cheryl Clark was our class valedictorian. She had a school average of about 105. She never got anything wrong, and she sat around considering questions like, why is there air? I actually liked Cheryl, but I never thought I was intelligent enough to engage her in any kind of a conversation. As Cheryl Clark was walking up to receive her diploma, a baby that was at the graduation got away from its mother and actually crawled up on the stage. Cheryl walked right past the baby, picked her diploma up, and walked right off the stage. Then up to the stage came Emery Cooper. I used to play basketball with Emery. I don't even know if Emery ever graduated from high school, but out of respect for everyone, they let everybody march. I've seen Emery hanging out on a few corners as years have gone by. But Emery Cooper, when he walked on the stage, picked the baby up, even though the baby drooled all over Emery's gown, and returned the baby to its mother, and by then they had called the next name, and Emery never got to walk up and get his diploma in front of everyone else. Well, he may not have had all of the ability that Cheryl Clark did, but he taught me something that day, and I hope it's something you'll remember. It's called priority. Don't forget yourselves, don't forget your spirit, don't forget your family, and don't forget your community. And thank you very much for having me today.